5 years after our divorce, I ran into my ex-husband at the mall. He was there to buy perfume to help with pregnancy-related mood swings. I was explaining the different options to him, but he seemed distracted. His gaze landed heavily on the scar on my gland. "Richard, have you been okay all these years on your own?" I looked up, my eyes sweeping calmly over his face. I gave him a polite smile. "I'm doing great. You don't need to worry about me." But Eric's eyes suddenly turned red. "Richard," he choked out, you don't hate me anymore?" I shook my head and said nothing more. Hate him? When I loved him, I did. But after a brush with death, I let it all go. Eric's eyes stayed fixed on me, as if he wanted to say something else. "Mr. Cole." I prompted him softly, tapping a finger on a bottle of morning dew. "Should I have this one wrapped for your wife?" The word wife seemed to sting him. The dark scent of absinthe, his pheromones, spilled out uncontrollably, bitter and carrying a familiar, oppressive weight. Couldn't help but frown. Eric snapped back to reality, his Adam's apple bobbing. He forced down the emotions churning in his eyes and said in a hoarse voice, "Just wrap up all the ones you just showed me." I nodded and turned to signal the assistant behind the counter to package them. The young beta girl swiftly pulled out a velvet gift box and complimented him as she worked. "Wow, you're so generous, sir. Your wife is a lucky woman." Eric glanced at me instinctively, as if searching for a crack in my composure, sadness, disgust, anything. The kind of reaction you'd expect from an ex-husband. Unfortunately for him, he failed. I was perfectly composed as I worked at the computer, entering the information and creating the order without so much as a flicker of my eyelashes. It was as if he were just another ordinary customer and that wife of his wasn't the homewrecker who destroyed my family. Eric lowered his gaze and, for some reason, started to explain. "Caleb's morning sickness has been really bad lately. The doctor said we could try a fragrance diffuser, but I wasn't sure which scent would work, so I'm just buying them all to try." Eric didn't know that the baby in Caleb's belly wasn't his, but I had no intention of bursting his bubble. I just nodded and handed him the receipt. "That'll be $38,400. Will you be paying by card, Mr. Cole?" After Eric paid and left, the young assistant leaned in and asked in a low voice, "Richard, isn't that the CEO of Stellar Tech?" I tossed the tester strips from the counter into the trash and nodded. The assistant kept gossiping. He seemed really sad. "Do you two know each other?" "Know each other? We were more than that. I was his ex-husband, the one who went from his childhood sweetheart to someone he couldn't stand to look at. When I first met Eric, he wasn't some big-shot CEO. He was just like me, a couple of sad kids living in a rundown apartment building. But he had it the worst. He grew up without a mother, with only a deadbeat dad who was an alcoholic and beat him. The constant abuse and malnutrition caused problems with Eric's presentation. Even though he presented as an alpha, he developed a severe pheromone imbalance. He became sensitive and irritable, like a volcano ready to erupt at any moment. Everyone avoided him. They laughed at him, called him useless, worse than even the lowest beta. But I didn't see him that way. To me, Eric was like a star covered in dust. He was meant to shine brightly, not just fade away. Again and again, I'd bring over lunches I'd made, climb through his window, and put medicine on his wounds while he huddled in a corner. Later, I learned how to be a perfumer. Other people might create fragrances to make something beautiful. But for me, in the beginning, I had only one goal, to save him. For countless days and nights, I would rest my head on the nape of Eric's neck, inhaling his scent over and over, trying to find a pattern in the chaos, something that could be soothed and guided. I tried thousands of times, starting over whenever I failed. The chaotic pheromones would make me throw up, but I never gave up. The failed attempts piled up, and the light in Eric's eyes began to dim. "Richard, just forget it," he told me, his voice full of self-loathing. "I'm just a monster beyond saving." That was the first time I ever got angry with him. "Eric Cole, anyone else can give up, but not you. You are not a monster. You never were. In my eyes, you've always been someone incredible. Promise me you'll never give up on yourself, okay?" And then I saw Eric, the boy who never cried when his father beat him or when everyone else shunned him, cry for the first time in front of me. After the experiment succeeded, Eric held me tight, his voice choked but firm. "Richard, thank you for giving me a second life. I'll protect you and be good to you for the rest of my life. Back then, his eyes were warm, and his promises were real. Even though we were flat broke, he'd work multiple jobs, saving every penny he earned just to buy me a decent suit for an interview. The most dangerous time, we were held up at knife point in an alley. Eric didn't hesitate to shield me with his body, and he got a deep cut across his stomach. Blood was pouring out, but he just smiled and tried to comfort me. "Richard, don't worry. I'm tough, it's nothing." When he was getting stitches, he was drenched in a cold sweat from the pain, but all he could say was, "Richard, I'm so glad you're okay." Back then, we were poor, struggling, and our future was a total blur. But we had each other. We had the conviction that we would do anything for one another. That's why even when we were living in a basement apartment and eating instant noodles, we never felt like life was hard. After Eric's first startup failed, he was drowning in debt and sat by the river, completely defeated. I didn't blame him. I just sat down next to him and rested my head on his shoulder. "Eric, it's okay. We're still young. We can fail and start over. Even if we have nothing, it doesn't matter. You still have me. I'll always be by your side." Eric held me and sobbed. He said he would succeed even if it was just for me. He said that when he got rich, he'd install heated floors for me, buy me the biggest house, and give me the best of everything in the world. I believed he could do it, and he really did. After he made it big, the center of his life was still me. He told me countless times, "Richard, you are my star. As long as I'm alive, all my energy, my entire orbit, will revolve around you." Young promises sound so goddamn beautiful, don't they? So beautiful they made me forget that stars burn out, and orbits can shift. My phone buzzed twice, pulling me from my thoughts. "Richard, don't forget your medicine. It's snowing outside. Wait for me, I'll come pick you up." I smiled without thinking and replied, "Okay, drive safe." As I put my phone away, the assistant was still gossiping. "His husband is also a perfumer, just like you." The other sales associate leaned in, curious. "He must be really good then, right? Has he created anything famous?" "There hasn't been much news lately, but Winter's Approach, which was a huge hit 5 years ago, was his creation." "Whoa, I know that one. It sold out as soon as it launched. The reviews were amazing. My friend even took out a loan to buy a bottle. It's a shame he never released anything after that. He probably settled down to focus on his family." Listened quietly, saying nothing. The perfume wasn't actually called Winter's Approach. Its real name was The Thaw. The top note was the chill of cedar, the middle note was the subtle fragrance of a budding plum blossom, and the base note was the scent of damp earth after sunlight melts the snow. I created it specifically for Eric during the hardest time of his startup. Eric used to say it was the scent of hope, that the ice and snow would eventually melt, and spring would always come. I never imagined it would become part of the spring he shared with someone else. When it was time to clock out, my coworkers were still talking in low voices. I had no interest in hearing more, so I wrapped my coat tighter and walked out of the mall. A cold wind whipped snow into my face. The scar on the back of my neck throbbed faintly in the cold. I instinctively hunched my shoulders. When I looked up, I saw Eric standing under a streetlight. His black cashmere coat was covered in snow. The scent of absinthe seemed especially sharp in the freezing air. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. He opened an umbrella and hurried over. "Richard, let me take you home." "No thanks." I stepped back to a safe distance. "Someone's coming to get me." Eric's hand, holding the umbrella, froze mid-air, but he stubbornly didn't move. Snowflakes fell between us, drawing an invisible line. I don't know what he was thinking, but Eric suddenly let out a low laugh. "Remember that time we were selling stuff on the street, and the city officers chased us off? It was snowing just like this. I grabbed your hand and we just ran. You suddenly said, 'Eric, doesn't this feel like we're eloping?'" Eric seemed completely lost in the memory. The gloom in his eyes was replaced by tenderness, and his voice softened as if he were afraid of disturbing the dream of that snowy night. "By the time we made it under the overpass, you'd lost your scarf. The tip of your nose was bright red from the cold, but you were laughing so happily, your eyes sparkling." Eric's gaze fell on my face, full of lingering affection. He seemed to be searching for any trace of nostalgia for the past. But once again he failed. He lowered his lashes and pressed on, refusing to give up. And do you remember? Every snowy night, I'd get into bed first to warm it up for you. You always loved to shove your cold feet into my arms, insisting that, Mr. Cole. I cut in calmly, what's the point of bringing all this up now? Eric's smile froze on his face. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but in the end, he just tightened his grip on the umbrella handle and whispered, I'm sorry, Richard. I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't be saying this, but seeing you today, I realized I can't forget you. I just can't. In the distance, a car approached, its bright headlights washing over us. I took half a step back, looked at his reddened eyes, and smiled faintly. Eric, I can't forget either. He looked up, his eyes filled with surprise. But then he heard me continue word by word, that it was snowing just like this on the day I caught you cheating. Eric's affair was with my apprentice, an Omega who smelled of gardenias. He was an orphan, and just like Eric, he suffered from a pheromone imbalance. The first time I saw him, he was huddled behind some discarded cardboard boxes, filthy and delirious with fever, giving off a sickly sweet, rotting scent. Eric stared at him, a desolate look on his face. I figured he was probably thinking of his own youth. If I hadn't stepped in to help him back then, he might have ended up just like that. So Eric offered him a hand, as if to save the boy he once was. He paid to send Caleb to the hospital to get treatment. When the doctors couldn't fix his gland, Eric came to me for help. Seeing Caleb trembling and afraid, my heart softened once again. The day he was cured, Caleb knelt before me, shaking with sobs. Richard, sir, you gave me this life. I'll spend the rest of it doing anything you ask to repay you. He had nowhere to go, so he stayed on as an apprentice in my perfumery. He didn't have much of a natural talent for it, but he was a hard worker and always tried his best. After my gland was accidentally destroyed, I had planned to leave the perfumery to him. Who would have thought he climbed into Eric's bed first? By then, Eric and I were already having a lot of problems. Long-term gland treatments and the side effects of the medication made me lose weight rapidly. Became sensitive to light and my nerves were shot. I guess deep love can't withstand the grind of a long illness. Eric had long since stopped looking at me with that initial tenderness and concern. He got busier and busier, coming home later and later, and always carrying the cloyingly sweet scent of unfamiliar pheromones. When I confronted him, he'd yank at his tie irritably. It's just business dinners. Can you stop being so sensitive? I'm already exhausted. He started complaining about how much pressure he was under. When the pain from my gland kept me up all night, he'd snap impatiently, Can't you just suck it up? I have an early meeting tomorrow. So he suggested we sleep in separate rooms. It used to be that he couldn't fall asleep at night without holding me. Now it was like I had become a burden to him. The stark contrast was more than I could handle. I wanted to talk things through, but every time I saw that impatient look on his face, I couldn't stop myself from breaking down. Our conversations devolved into hysterics. One snowy day, after a fight, he stormed out and slammed the door. I sat on the floor crying for a long time, then started to wonder if I was being too emotional, if I had driven him away. I ordered his favorite flowers and went with a gift to apologize to the basement apartment where we used to live. Whenever Eric was upset, he'd go there to be alone. Sure enough, he was there this time, too. The door was slightly ajar. I took a couple of steps forward, but then I heard the sticky, intimate sounds of panting from inside. In the cramped space, the scents of absinthe and gardenia were tangled together in a frenzy. I saw Caleb pinned beneath Eric on the same bed where we used to hold each other as we slept. His face was flushed, the whites of his eyes rolling back uncontrollably as broken whimpers escaped his lips. In that instant, my world shattered. The gift fell to the floor, the flowers crushed underfoot. I rushed in like a madman, screaming the most vicious things I could think of at them and smashing everything in sight. Eric just shielded Caleb behind him, watching me lose my mind with cold indifference. Richard, look at yourself. What have you become? He stood there amid the wreckage, his eyes filled with nothing but weariness and judgment. He looked at me and said heartlessly, one word at a time, a complete and utter lunatic. The memory of those cold eyes slowly merged with the guilty ones in front of me now. Eric swayed on his feet. Richard, back then Just then, a black sedan pulled up silently by the curb. The window rolled down, and a gentle male voice called out, "Richard, over here." Seeing who it was, Eric's pupils contracted. He froze for a moment. Then, as if he understood something, he suddenly smiled. "Richard," he said, taking a step forward, but his gaze went past me to Dr. Hayes's face. "I'll see you tomorrow." His tone was lilting, less like a goodbye and more like a declaration of war. Didn't respond. I just adjusted my scarf and got into the car. The door shut, closing off the swirling snow outside, and with it, his pathologically obsessive face. In the rearview mirror, the figure holding the black umbrella stood stubbornly in place, growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared completely into the curtain of snow. The car stopped at a red light. Dr. Hayes turned up the heat and handed me a thermos.
Kingertea.
"Drink it while it's hot." I held the warm cup and thanked him softly. "You look pale." Dr. Hayes gave me a deep look and asked gently, "Is it the old injury acting up? Or is someone bothering you?" I shook my head as a wave of exhaustion washed over me. I pinched the bridge of my nose with one hand. "It's nothing. It's all in the past. But your ex-husband doesn't seem ready to give up." Dr. Hayes paused, his voice still steady. "Do you need me to help you?" "No." I refused his kind offer, then added after a thought, "Dr. Hayes, you've already done more than enough for me." Dr. Hayes nodded. He didn't press the issue and smoothly started the car again. The car fell silent. As I watched the snowy scenery fly by, I couldn't help but think back to when I first met Dr. Hayes. It was the darkest moment of my life. For a long time, I couldn't even bear to think about it. After being forced to sign the divorce papers, I swallowed a handful of sleeping pills. Wearing the first suit Eric ever bought for me, I walked into the freezing ocean. I woke up in a clinic, with an 4 in my arm and my neck wrapped in bandages. The stomach pump was successful, Dr. Hayes said, holding a chart at the foot of my bed. "Your gland was necrotizing, so I removed it." "My gland? Removed?" The words were like a thunderclap in my dead-silent world. I thrashed wildly, ripping the 4 needle out. Droplets of blood splattered on the white sheets. "Who gave you permission to remove it? Who gave you the right?" The wound tore open, staining the bandages red, but I felt no pain, only an overwhelming panic. Without my gland, what am I? A total monster. A useless freak with no gland. The taunts Eric and Caleb used to throw at me came back, slicing me apart all over again. Dr. Hayes came forward to restrain me, but I bit down hard on his wrist, the taste of blood filling my mouth. He grunted in pain but didn't pull away. "What good would keeping it have done, other than cause you more pain?" Dr. Hayes's voice was still calm. "If I hadn't removed it, the only path left for you was death. Then you should have let me die." I screamed. "What right do you have to interfere? You're an unethical doctor. I hate you. I'll make you pay for this." I was like a lunatic, unable to move but trying to bite anything he handed me, glaring at him with pure hatred. Dr. Hayes just calmly cleaned up the mess and said, "Are you done venting? It's time for your shot. You have to live if you want to get revenge on me." I never expected that I would, in fact, live, and that 5 years would pass. The next day, as expected, Eric came back. He had bought the entire mall and reappeared as its new owner. He laid out the perfumery studio I had always dreamed of, along with rare ingredients I'd only ever seen in ancient books, all right in front of me. "Richard," Eric's voice was soft, deliberately trying to please. "I was wrong before. Please give me another chance. Let me make it up to you, okay?" He handed me a thick contract of conveyance. I looked at the gift, one that would make any perfumer go crazy with joy, and frowned. "Mr. Cole, you're a married man. Please have some self-respect." A flash of panic crossed Eric's eyes, as if he hadn't expected this reaction. He took a step forward, anxious. "Richard, once Caleb has the baby, I'll divorce him. Just wait a little longer. Don't worry, the position of Mrs. Cole will still be yours." Hearing his familiar, disgusting lines made me want to laugh. That's what he said back when I caught him with Caleb, too. "Richard, Caleb isn't going to take your place as my husband." When I accused him of changing the subject and cheating, he just scoffed and shamelessly turned it back on me. "I'm a normal alpha. I need to take care of myself during my ruts. Richard, who's the one here with no pheromones? I'm just using him as a suppressant." Can't you just be reasonable about this? I couldn't accept his excuses and screamed that I wanted a divorce. Eric grabbed me by the throat. Looking at my flushed face, his tone was contemptuous and cruel. Divorce? You dare leave me, and I'll dare to ruin your reputation. Richard, feel the back of your neck. You're a disabled omega with a failing gland. How are you going to survive without me? Huh? He was right. How would I survive? The delayed despair washed over me like ice water. My failing gland had made me mentally fragile, half crazy. The immense shock had also nearly destroyed my sense of smell. A perfumer who couldn't smell. A complete and utter waste. Without him, I had nowhere else to go. And from that day on, Eric dropped the mask completely. He began appearing in public with Caleb, even being affectionate with him right in front of me. He loved to see me break down. It was proof that I still loved him. We lived together in that sick way, until Caleb got pregnant and taunted me with it. My mind finally broke. I think I pushed him. He fell, and a shocking pool of red spread out from under him. Eric rushed in. Seeing the scene, he slapped me hard across the face. The taste of blood filled my throat, and my ears were ringing. In a daze, I thought I saw the teenage Eric. He was holding me, saying with reverence, "Richard, you are my light, my life. If I, Eric Cole, ever betray you in this life, may I be struck by lightning and die a horrible death." Time is a funny thing, isn't it? It so easily turns a sincere heart rotten. The man who once swore to protect me, in order to avenge an unborn child, didn't hesitate to push me down the stairs. Tumbling, impact, the sound of bones breaking one after another. He watched me with cold detachment the entire time and never sent me to the hospital. Instead, he had me locked up in a mental institution, where I was subjected to endless torment. And now, 5 years later, that same rotten heart was beating for me again. He had the gall to say, "Don't worry, you'll still be my husband." My nails dug into my palms, the sharp pain grounding me. I fought back my nausea and replied, "No, thank you, Mr. Cole. I have a new life now." The pleading in Eric's eyes was instantly replaced by a dark gloom. A new life? With that beta doctor? He snorted, his tone dripping with disdain. "What can he give you? A lab? The smell of disinfectant?" My heart sank. It looked like he'd already made a move against Dr. Hayes. I had no desire to waste any more words on him. I looked him straight in the eye and reminded him, "Eric, don't forget that when your pheromones were out of control, you were worse off than the most ordinary beta." Eric's face changed in an instant, as if my words were a slap across the face. "Richard, you never used to talk to me like this. Now you're humiliating me for him?" "This has nothing to do with him," I said, shaking my head. "Eric, I just see you for who you really are now." With that, I turned to leave. Eric let out a couple of crazed laughs and suddenly called out, "Richard, I will make you understand who the only person capable of protecting you is." I paused but didn't turn back. Once I found an empty corner, I called Dr. Hayes. He picked up almost immediately. His gentle, steady voice came through the line, with the faint hum of lab equipment in the background that was strangely calming. "Richard?" "Dr. Hayes," my voice was tight. "Eric, did he do something to you?" He understood before I even finished. But he didn't answer directly. Instead, he tried to reassure me in a light tone. "Don't worry, he can't affect me." I had seen firsthand how vicious Eric's methods could be. Dr. Hayes was leading a major national-level laboratory project. I could imagine Eric's tactics. Cutting off his funding, poaching his team members, even spreading rumors to create academic scandals, and plenty of other dirty tricks I couldn't even think of. Even if it didn't kill him, it would leave him scarred. There was no way it was as easy as Dr. Hayes was making it sound. I gripped my phone, my knuckles turning white. "Dr. Hayes, I'm so sorry. I've dragged you into this." A very faint laugh came from the other end of the line, like a ray of winter sun breaking through the clouds. "Richard," he said, his voice gentle but certain, "you really don't need to apologize to me." Probably to put my mind at ease, he paused, then added, "My background is a little more complicated than you might think." I knew Dr. Hayes. He never made empty promises. So I just nodded. "That's good. Richard, this business with him." Dr. Hayes' tone returned to his usual calm and respectful one. "I understand you don't want me to interfere. You have your own way of doing things, and I trust you can handle it." He paused for a moment, his voice softening even more. Go do what you need to do. You don't have to worry about me. But remember, anytime you need me, I'm here. 1,000 words caught in my throat, but they all boiled down to 2. Thank you. You're welcome, Dr. Hayes said, his voice smiling. What do you want for dinner? I'm almost done at the lab. I thought for a moment. Fish congee. The kind you made last time was amazing. Eric didn't give up on harassing me. He arrogantly believed he could give me everything I wanted. He thought the only reason I wouldn't take him back was because Caleb stood between us. He promised me again and again. All he wanted was the child in Caleb's belly. As soon as the baby was born, he would cut ties with Caleb completely and give me a magnificent wedding. Richard, I need a healthy heir, but you can't have children without a gland. My hands were tied. I know you've been wronged all these years, and you have every right to hate me. Don't worry, after we get married, I'll make it all up to you. Whether you want to stay home or go back to work, I won't say a word. I'll support you in everything. No matter how cold I was, no matter how clearly I refused him, it was like he couldn't understand. He just continued to live in his own world, doing whatever he pleased. After a while of this, Caleb couldn't stand it anymore and came looking for me. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. He had shed that timid, in need of protection persona. He wore an expensive designer suit, and his jewelry sparkled, creating an air of aristocratic elegance. He held his chin slightly raised. The arrogance in his expression was impossible to hide. But between his brows, there was a knot of anxiety that wouldn't dissolve. When he saw me, he exclaimed in feigned surprise, "Richard, sir, it really is you. Why didn't you say anything when you came back?" He spoke with an intimacy that suggested we were still a close master and apprentice. "I've been looking for you for the past 5 years. Someone said you jumped into the sea and died, but I never believed it." He walked closer, his eyes scanning my uniform and name tag, then covered his mouth in mock astonishment. "Richard, sir, didn't you lose your sense of smell? How did you end up as a sales clerk at a perfume shop?" He deliberately paused there, as if he'd misspoken, and said apologetically, "Oh, my mistake. I meant a perfumer." 5 years had passed, and Caleb was still the same, pretending to be concerned while hiding a venomous heart. Back when my gland was failing, he used to say the same kinds of ambiguous things in front of Eric. "Eric, Richard is such a good person. It breaks my heart to see him like this. I wish I could suffer in his place. Eric, I'm so jealous of Richard, having a devoted partner like you who never leaves his side. If I could have a husband like you and a child, my life would be complete. Eric, you have to take care of yourself. This family can't survive without you." I looked at this man, whose manipulative act had only gotten more polished, and let out a low laugh. Caleb was taken aback by my reaction. "What are you laughing at?" I stopped laughing, my gaze turning ice cold as I stared at him. If I'm not a perfumer, I could always just take it easy as the new Mr. Cole for a while. He definitely knew that Eric was planning to kick him to the curb, so he definitely understood the threat in my words. Sure enough, Caleb's face instantly turned ashen. After taking a deep breath, he seemed to have made some sort of decision. He lowered his voice, but his tone was filled with malice. "Richard, have you ever wondered why your gland was destroyed all those years ago?" At his words, my hand paused over the mortar. Caleb watched my reaction with satisfaction, like a snake that had finally found an opening, and flicked out his tongue. "You were so successful back then, weren't you? Your perfumery career was taking off, and you had countless admirers. Eric saw it all. He tried to convince you to give up perfumery and just be a good little omega at home, but you refused. So, he had me give him a little help." My heart stopped in that moment, and my blood ran cold. The plan was just to make you lose your sense of smell for a while. But who could have known your gland was so fragile it would fail completely? Caleb sighed with feigned regret, but his eyes glittered with cruel delight. "When you think about it, the one who destroyed everything for you was the very man you loved with all your heart. It's ironic, isn't it?" The pestle slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. No wonder. No wonder when Eric found out I'd miscarried our 2-month-old fetus because of my failing gland. He looked so regretful. I thought he was upset that he hadn't taken better care of me. Turns out, he was just upset about the bad timing of his attack. At the time, he knelt by my bed and swore, Richard, it doesn't matter if you have no pheromones, no child. I love you. All I want is you. Haha, I was so stupid back then, so moved by that. A metallic taste rose in my throat, but I forced it back down. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady my collapsing body, lifted my head to look at Caleb's triumphant face, and forced a smile. Then you should take a guess, too. Why was I so sure back then that the baby you were carrying wasn't Eric's? Watching his face drain of color, I continued, word by word, and the one you're carrying now isn't his child, either. Caleb stumbled back 2 steps. He wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. So he shut his mouth. After a long silence, he finally seemed to process it. Eric used your pheromones to manage his symptoms for years. He's not even capable of getting someone pregnant. That's right. You're so clever, I said with a smile. The child he killed back then was his one and only. Caleb instinctively cradled his stomach, as if weighing his options. I scoffed, calling him out directly. What? Thinking of faking a miscarriage and blaming me just like last time? But Caleb just smiled and shook his head. Richard, sir, let's just say this is a thank you for helping me all those years ago. I'm going to give you a big gift. I didn't care about his gift. I just packaged the security footage and sent it anonymously to Eric. When Eric found me, I was staring out at the ocean. The salty, damp sea breeze hit my face, carrying the same scent as that night 5 years ago. During those days of torment in the mental institution, I kept thinking about what I had done wrong. Is kindness a cardinal sin? My father taught me from a young age to help others. He practiced what he preached, right up until he died saving someone's life. The drowning student he saved was afraid of taking responsibility and never admitted what happened. My mother's hair turned white overnight, and she eventually died of a broken heart. I've helped a lot of people in my life, too. The ones I gave the most to were Eric and Caleb, and my reward was the knives they plunged into my back. I kept thinking, if my family and I hadn't been so kind, would things have turned out better? But there are no do-overs. Back then, it wasn't just heartbreak I was dealing with. The torment of the gland's after effects, the pain of losing my child, the despair of being abandoned. Countless times, I thought about just ending it all. But whenever I closed my eyes, I'd hear my father's words, "Be strong. The sun always comes out after the storm. Things will get better." But they never did. The only thing that came was the divorce papers Eric sent. I was finally free. But after leaving the institution, everyone pointed fingers at me. Some with pity, some with glee. But without exception, they all treated me like I was crazy. I couldn't find a job, couldn't get any respect. I gritted my teeth and lived in humiliation. Every single day in agony. The day Eric and Caleb got married, I swallowed a handful of sleeping pills and walked into the ocean, my heart filled with endless bitterness. If I could do it all over again, I wouldn't save them. I wouldn't have anything to do with them ever again. But I didn't get a do-over. Dr. Hayes saved me. He removed my gland, which should have been removed long ago. But I had no motivation to live, so I found an excuse to hate him and fought him every day. He didn't care. Instead, he showed me through his actions. I was never a failed omega. I was first and foremost a living person. I was myself. Perfumery was my talent, but it wasn't the entirety of my worth. Even if I could never again create another fragrance, my very existence was worthy of love and respect. Later I learned that he never forgot about removing my gland, and he had been researching artificial ones ever since. The treatment was painful, but it was a choice I made after careful consideration. I wanted my sense of smell back. I loved making perfumes. When my nerves were being reconstructed, the pain was so intense I nearly passed out, but I bit my lip and didn't make a sound. Dr. Hayes told me that it was okay to scream, okay to cry, that even if I broke down, it wasn't my fault. It was a normal stress response to extreme pain. In that moment, I suddenly started to cry, so it was okay to cry and break down. It wouldn't make people hate me. In the first half of my life, my father only taught me to be kind to others. In those 5 years, Dr. Hayes taught me to be kind to myself. I thought again of Eric and Caleb. If fate wasn't going to punish them, then I would. Eric stood before me crying crocodile tears. Richard, it wasn't like that. I never meant to hurt you. It was Caleb who got the dosage wrong. I shook my head, my voice cold. Caleb said my gland was too fragile. Do you know why? After a colleague of mine died from overwork, I worried I might suddenly die too. So I drained my own pheromones to make you a lifetime supply of stabilizers, thinking that even if I died, you wouldn't have to suffer from your imbalance anymore. But while I was pouring my heart and soul out for you, what were you doing? You were plotting how to destroy me. I bet you didn't know. Did you? My pheromones were the most important ingredient in your stabilizers. The color drained from Eric's face, leaving it a sickly gray. No, Richard, that's not it. Let me explain. He reached for my hand in a panic. I just wanted you to come back home. I never wanted to destroy you. I just love you too much. I was afraid of losing you. Love? I repeated the word softly and couldn't help but laugh. Then your love is truly disgusting. Richard, I regretted it later. I really did. Eric explained desperately. I know I was wrong. Please just give me one more chance. Watching his tear-streaked face, I found the whole thing ridiculous. I turned to leave, but he suddenly dropped to his knees and grabbed my leg. Richard, I can make it up to you. I'll do anything you want. Shares? Assets? I can give you anything, as long as you forgive me. The sharp scent of absinthe filled the air again. I took a step back and asked, Really? Anything? Eric's eyes lit up. Of course. Then what if I asked you to turn yourself in and go to jail? Eric froze, then forced a laugh after a moment. Don't joke, Richard. You couldn't do it. I know you. You never could bear to see me suffer. That was before. Now, the sight of you just makes me sick. Covered my nose and mouth, frowning. Also, I forgot to tell you, your pheromones, they really stink. With that, I turned and walked toward Dr. Hayes, who was waiting quietly a short distance away. Behind me, Eric let out a pained, guttural howl. Pheromones erupted from him in an uncontrolled tide, carrying a wave of destructive despair, before being swiftly scattered by the sea breeze. I didn't look back, not even for a second. The immense shock caused Eric's pheromone imbalance to relapse violently. And as for Caleb's so-called big gift, he had smashed all the stabilizers I had ever left for him. It didn't really matter whether he smashed them or not. For days, Eric had been clinging to me, trying to scent my new pheromones. They were odorless and scentless, but they counteracted my old ones. After enough exposure, the old stabilizers had lost their effect anyway. I heard the scene was a complete disaster. Eric beat Caleb half to death. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, drooling, dependent on others to survive. Eric's body, completely wrecked by the pheromone collapse, gave out. His business rivals all moved in for the kill, carving up the empire he had built, and his company's stock plummeted. At the same time, someone anonymously posted a long essay online, detailing step-by-step how Eric had schemed to destroy his former husband, complete with concrete evidence. His carefully crafted public image as a successful entrepreneur and devoted husband completely shattered overnight, and he was condemned across the internet. Shortly after, the IRS launched an investigation, uncovering years of massive tax evasion and other financial crimes. An old cold case was also reopened. The fall that killed his alcoholic father years ago was not an accident after all. Sentenced on multiple counts, Eric was given 20 years. His pheromone imbalance was incurable. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, suffering from both physical and psychological torment. At first, I would click on the news articles about it, but after a while, I gradually stopped paying attention. I entered the latest international perfumery competition and spent my days running between the lab and the library. So busy I barely had time to breathe. The sun was shining brightly outside, and all the events of the past were finally drowned out by the sound of my own footsteps as I hurried toward my new life. My future was ahead of me. Epilogue. Eric had a very long dream. In the dream, he and Richard never divorced. Richard's gland never failed. Every day, he was surrounded by pheromones that felt like a sun-drenched blanket, warm and comforting. They had a 3-year-old daughter. She wore her hair in cute little pigtails, and the moment she saw him, she would come running on her stubby legs. "Daddy's home," she'd shout, throwing herself into his arms. The little girl would look up, her eyes just like Richard's, bright and sparkling, filled with adoration and trust. "Daddy, the craft you helped me with won first place. The teacher gave me 3 gold stars. I love you, Daddy." You're the best. He would scoop her up and lift her high over his head, listening to her laughter, as crisp as a bell, so full of happiness it felt like it would overflow. Hearing the noise, Richard would peek out from his studio, smiling and chiding, "Be careful, don't drop her." He'd walk over and wrap his arms around Richard from behind, resting his chin gently on the top of his head. "What new scent are you working on? Let me be the first to smell it." Richard would smile and hold a tester strip to his nose. Their daughter would come bouncing over, demanding to smell it too. She couldn't make out the notes, but she'd just murmur, "Mommy, this smells like home." Richard would gently boop her little nose. "That's right, my brilliant baby. This one is called home." After dinner, he'd build blocks with his daughter while Richard hummed a tune and washed fruit in the kitchen. A light-hearted cartoon played on the TV. When his daughter got tired of playing, she'd climb onto his back and tell him stories about preschool. Her voice would trail off, and then she'd be asleep. In that moment, he felt so peaceful, so content, as if he had the whole world in his hands. Drip, drip. The sound of dripping water pulled him back to reality. A tearing pain shot through his gland. Eric's eyes flew open, a cold sweat soaking his thin prison uniform. There were no sun-drenched pheromones, no after-dinner games, and no soft call of daddy. The room was filled only with the desperate, bitter scent of absinthe and his own unending pain. In the corner of the cell, the old television was playing the news. The picture flickered, but he could still see it clearly. Richard had won first place in the international perfumery competition. He stood on the winner's podium, smiling with confidence and grace. He had finally become his own star. That was good. Even though he knew Richard couldn't hear him, he still whispered to the empty room, "Congratulations."